Talk a little bit about your most recent study. Can you give me an overview of what you and your colleagues are looking at?
My current graduate, a recent graduate, Dr. Luca, we were interested in looking at the relationship between early pointing and vocabulary development. And this is a really robust finding in the literature where the more babies point, the larger their vocabularies. And pointing in particular can predict the first words, so the objects that infants are pointing at. You can predict pretty reliably that will enter into the first 50 words of their vocabulary. So this relationship has been really well established and robust. And so one of the things that we were interested in is there's been lots of speculation of the mechanisms. What drives this relationship? And the long-standing thought was that parents. So when babies point and when that parents are interpreting those points or translating or providing input. But all of the research had really been correlational in many ways. And there had been one really cool experimental study where they had trained pointing and they had encouraged infants to point more in a picture book. And the infants that were trained ended up having a larger vocabulary. And again, it was sort of a longitudinal study, but this was leading us to believe that there were some underlying mechanisms within the child. It wasn't just simply that the child was pointing and getting input, that there was something going on in the actual act of pointing that may be playing a role in infants' early word learning. So we wanted to explore this, and this was my graduate student's idea, and we worked together to design a study. And the initial study that we did was really just looking at when you try to elicit a point from an infant. Hey, look at these two objects, they're so cute. Which one do you want? Point to the one you like. One, we made the assumption that, of course, infants would point because we told them to. And 12-month-olds and 18-month-olds, of course, would be obedient and listen. And so we didn't really have a backup plan for the idea that babies maybe wouldn't point for us. And so my student at the time came in to me and said, Dr. Wilbourn, they're not always pointing. Sometimes they're reaching and sometimes they're looking. And, as a good advisor, of course, because I had considered that, I said, we'll just analyze it. We'll just, on the trials they point, we'll just look at that, and on the trials they reach. It was just sort of a solution to the problem of a lot of 12-month-olds, we couldn't actually get them to point. And 18-month-olds, it was actually less frequent than we thought it would be. Well, lo and behold, when we looked at the data, the infants, no matter what, they were getting the label. So if they looked at the object, or if they pointed to the object, or if they reached for it, the experimenter always said, oh, you want the blicket, see, it's the blicket, or the toma, or whatever novel word we were using. But the infants only provided evidence of actually learning the word on the trials they pointed. And this was quite surprising. And when you think about it, the same infant in the same experimental, on one trial pointing will learn the novel word. The next trial decides to reach, you say the novel word, they don't learn it. So this was really powerful because it was, again, within the same infant, we're seeing different rates of learning based on different communicative behaviors. And these are behaviors that are self-generated, even though we're, trying to elicit a point. So this was very exciting, and we then published the paper, and one of the things that we were kind of playing with was the hypothesis that when babies point, one, it's clear that they're in this readiness to learn. So the fact that baby Emma would point and learn the label, but when she reaches, she doesn't, tells us that there's something special about when I'm pointing, right? But the question we had was, what makes it special? So we hypothesized that by 18 months, infants had formed expectations about what a point would specifically elicit, right? So the 12-month-olds in the earlier study didn't show this differential learning, but the 18-month-olds did. So we figured that somewhere between 12 and 18 months, infants are acquiring enough experience and they're forming these expectations. So to test this, we did a subsequent study with just 18-month-olds. And we provided them with different types of information. So the same infant would point on a trial and we would, which one do you want? And then we would provide a label on one trial, look, it's a Modi, see? Or on a subsequent trial, when the infant pointed, we'd say, oh, it does this, giving a function. And then we had a third part where if the infant indicated they wanted something, we would just acknowledge it, sharing attention. Yeah, I see it, I see, yeah. And so we wanted to see within the same infant whether getting different types of information altered their behavior. And this was a way of sort of going at the back end of looking at this expectation. And so we measured the same things we measured in the earlier studies, rates of learning. Did the infants actually show evidence of learning the word? And we replicated, thankfully, that they only showed evidence of learning the word when they were pointing. But what we also found was that infants, when you gave them a function or a no information, continued to try to elicit information from the communicative exchange. So the experimenter, when she said, look, it does this, the baby would persist in their communicative attempts. So for example, if on the first trial the baby pointed and the experimenter said, oh, it does this, the infant might then reach again or tap on there or make a vocalization like, this persistence. And we found that infants only persisted on the trials that they did not get a label. So if they got a function, or if it was clear that they were sharing attention with the experimenter but not getting a specific label, we found that significantly more often infants would continue to try to elicit communication.
So what does this suggest? This
suggests that already by 18 months, infants have an expectation that when they point, they're going to get a word, a label. And that this is an expectation that they've clearly acquired in their environment, most often because that's what caregivers and research has shown caregivers are most often giving labels when infants are pointing. The other beautiful part about the finding is it highlights that the infants are really not only acting on, so the fact that when they point, they're in this readiness to learn, but that they're using experiences and building these expectations in new environments with new people and using these tools in order to acquire knowledge and information. The cool part about the finding is even though infants have this expectation for labels, they're actually able to learn both the labels and the functions readily well. Like it was easy for them to learn both. And that's also really advantageous because it would be really difficult if a child had such an expectation where they limited out any other information and weren't able to learn about the function, for example. So this readiness to learn is beneficial overall.
What does this suggest to parents?
For parents, it's very clear that when an infant is pointing, they are trying to elicit information about the object. They don't simply just want it. And so a recommendation that we often give parents is label, describe, really highlight and discuss what your infant is interested in, specifically when they're pointing. Because it's clear that when they're reaching or looking at an object, they don't have the same expectation to learn. And so it's very difficult when an infant is that young to know when they're in a state of readiness to learn. And the nice thing is at 18 months, they give us really clear indicators. By pointing, this highlights I'm open, I'm available, I'm attending, and I'm ready to learn whatever it is that you're ready to teach me.
So number one, label. Number two, describe. Where do parents go from there in terms of helping their child develop knowledge and language skills?
You know, what I think parents are doing naturally is when their child is interested, we clearly know that they're labeling, going further and describing the object in different ways, and then as infants get older, describing how people think or feel about the object. So one of the things that we're interested in pursuing is looking at the emotional. So when you have an object and you label it and you talk about what it does, how do you feel about it? How do you like it? Is it pleasant? Is it something that makes you feel happy? And this is another way to extend out the types of information that infants can be exposed to in this state of readiness to learn that's the most advantageous. And so that's one of the things that we tell parents is just really talk about what you think and feel and what the object is, because that's what your child is really interested in.
What are the implications down the road?
Well, what we do know is that previous work has shown that the more infants point, the higher or larger their vocabulary. And what our data is showing is that the mechanism by which that might be happening is this readiness to learn. So if parents are really, exploiting this or taking advantage of this ripe opportunity, there's no question to me that this will have implications in how children learn and continue to build this vocabulary, but also to extend out into in more depth and more complicated, complex ideas about objects or about things in their world. So we think that long-term, parents who are coupling or using as a contingency this information blitz, let's say, during this ideal time, we'll end up having infants that are, one, more curious, because by pointing and getting this information, I acted on my environment, I got reinforced for it. So that's going to, one, strengthen bonds. Two, I think we're going to see a lot more of those pointing behaviors, especially since we know that infants will persist if they don't get the label. And then that will equate to more learning and a larger knowledge base. And this, to me, is ultimately the foundation. What we know with early vocabulary, it predicts so many outcomes. In particular, especially, a 3-year-old's early vocabulary development predicts their first grade reading achievement. And this is a way that we can work to close some of the achievement gaps in less advantaged populations where we typically see vocabulary differences by acting on these early behaviors that infants are doing. We can facilitate early vocabulary and language development before they ever take their first step into kindergarten.
We were watching Winnie, and obviously she's been through the ropes before, but instead of a point, it was more of a gesture toward it. What does that indicate? We
looked at various types of pointing. So there were times where infants would point with a whole hand, and we considered that a point. An index finger pointing is very clear what the infant is focused on. But when a whole hand point, we also think is part of this sort of development of understanding the utility of the specific index finger point, which is really a uniquely human, and it's a very complex skill. Even though non-human primates have the physical capability of pointing, chimpanzees, they actually don't. And you can train them, but they will only point with humans who've trained them. They don't extend that pointing to conspecifics or other primates. So this index finger pointing is a development, and it's something that occurs through experience and shaping behavior. So we counted this whole hand pointing. Now, if the child leaned in any way, we considered that a reach. So there's lots of ways infants would gesture towards an object which would indicate that they were interested or pointing. A reach has a specific goal of wanting to obtain that object, and that's where we made the distinction.
We saw not just an index finger point, but kind of an open gesture. So there is a little bit of a difference?
Well, what we see is that often infants will do what's called a whole hand point. And we considered that also an indicator similar to an index finger point because there was not the lean. So if an infant reaches and leans, whether the hand's down or up, we consider that to be a reach because of the body movement indicating I want the object. But what we see is that these sorts of side pointing where it's clear that they're not reaching for the object, but they're indicating using a gesture that this is the object of interest. We think that there's a development of going from these sort of whole hand points to the index finger point. And so we coded those or considered any sort of point or gesture indicating the specific object that did not have a lean as a point.
Anything I didn't ask you that would be important for parents to know?
I think one of the most exciting things about our findings is that there's so much change going on from 12 months to 18 months. And if you think about it, it's 6 months. But what infants are learning and the expectations they're building and the way they're integrating this information, it really is laying this incredible foundation for all subsequent learning. And so I think the moral of the story is that what parents are doing naturally is working because we're seeing that this is this developmental change and shift in 6 months of just having exposure to interacting with caregivers. And we know that at about 12 months is when infants are walking, typically, and the world looks very different. And by standing upright and moving around, this frees up your hands and allows you to interact with your caregivers in very different ways. And so for me, just keep doing what you're doing. And if there's any recommendation, talk a little more and specifically talk about what your infant is pointing or indicating interest in. And that's a really easy recommendation. We're often telling parents, read more and buy this and put this on. And one of the simple things about our study is It seems like what parents are naturally doing is facilitating the way infants are learning. And we just need to keep doing that and being in tune to our infants. And it appears that that's the foundation that they need to grow.
What's your area of expertise?
I'm a developmental psychologist. Specifically, I study early infant cognition and language development.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about your background, where you got your undergraduate, your master's.
I went to Cal State Fullerton, and I got a bachelor's degree there. Took a year off, trying to find myself, of course, and then decided to go back and do a master's. And I ended up going back to Cal State Fullerton and doing a master's. And I had no idea really what I wanted to do, but I fell in love with developmental psychology, and I really fell in love with research. And so I worked in a bunch of different labs and had incredible mentors who were very inspiring and encouraged me to pursue a PhD. I didn't even know what that was really at the time. I was a first-generation college kid, just getting a bachelor's. I thought that was, there's more. And so then I went on and did a PhD at Cornell University in the Department of Human Development, and studied infant language cognition, and then got a job here at Duke.